She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew, "and that's the truth. And not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, that he's ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? You don't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, for they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight. "Oh, well, I'm very glad to hear it," says Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Okay, I'm not gonna belabor the point, but as much as I love Charles Dickens, all of his women characters are like this. We don't get any description of Fred, or, what he looks like, if he's attractive, if he's like a good husband. But the only description that we get of his wife is whether or not she's cute. He even uses this terrible word, satisfactory, like she's pretty enough. And then, he kind of talks in this condescending way about her, the narrator, I mean. And then, of course, like, this is a young couple, so there's teasing between them. So there's this dynamic that, Fred teases his wife of like, haha, he doesn't have this dinner, these young housekeepers, which, I guess is like cutesy between them. I would find it super annoying if I like cooked a dinner and then my husband used that as a joke, but whatever, smash patriarchy. But the other reason that they have this, that I want to like explain this dynamic, is cause there's like a little side romance. You have to kind of read between the lines a little bit. So the people present at the party are Fred's wife, and then Fred's sisters-in-law. So the wife's sisters. And then they have this bachelor friend, Topper. And Topper has the hots for one of the sisters-in-law. So you just kind of have to, like, catch the teasing, and the dynamic there. Anyway. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eyes upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that he was a bachelor and a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. "He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried very hard to do it with aromatic vinegar, his example was unanimously followed. And this aromatic vinegar that she has, just are smelling salts, which, ladies used to carry around, because their constitutions are very delicate. Ladies faint all the time because their emotions just make them very hysterical, whatever. Actually, women did faint a lot because they had corsets and, they couldn't breathe. So that will, cause you to faint, but whatever. "I was only gonna say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail against Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday." It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge. But being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played, among other tunes, a simple little air, a mere nothing, you might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. And just a reminder, the child who fetched Kid Scrooge from the boarding school was little Fan, the little sister who's Fred's mother. So it's actually very lovely that Fred's wife plays at Christmas time on the harp this tune or this song that she'd either learned from his mother or that he has, remembered from his mother. I think that's very sweet and loving. When this strain of music sounded, all the things the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. This whole section is parlor games. No electricity, no TV, so people entertain themselves with music, as we've already seen, but they also played tons and tons and tons of parlor games, and some of the games were based on wordplay. Some of them are like run around games. I don't know, go find yourself a vintage book of parlor games. Some of them are pretty fun. Some of them are racy. Some of them are a little racy. But because they're all happening in public, they're all happening in the parlor. So this is like a safe way to flirt. Okay. After a while, they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop. There was a game at Blind Man's Buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe that Topper was really blind than I believe that he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. The way he went after the plump sister and the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would have instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when, in spite of all her silken wrestlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was the most execrable, for his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. So, yeah, supposedly he has the blindfold on, but he's obviously like going after the plump sister, and then they make out behind the curtain. So, like I said, a little racy. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's buff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. The implication here, and it's very, very, very subtle, is that she's pregnant, and that's why she cannot join in to these running around games. She's made comfortable in the chair and footstool. But she joined in the forfeits and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you, so that's cute. Fred is proud when his wife is smart. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right, too, for the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel, warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes, and lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found it! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as the answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they'd ever had any tendency that way. "He's given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge!" "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man wherever he is." "Whatever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful, on foreign lands, and they were close at home, by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope, by poverty, and it was rich, in almshouse, hospital, and jail, and misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door, and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they had passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left a children's 12th night party. When looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. My life upon this globe is very brief, replied the ghost. It ends tonight. Tonight, cried Scrooge. Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near. The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment. I just want to make this observation before I get into like kind of a serious part. I've always thought that's weird. If the Ghost of Christmas Present is like he is Christmas itself, so he only lives for 24 hours and he dies at midnight, then why isn't he a baby at the beginning? Why is he already an adult man? I have always wondered this. Okay, now a more serious part. Forgive me if I am not justified in what I asked, said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. But I see something strange, and not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot? Or a claw? It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it, said the spirit's sorrowful reply. Look here. From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. Oh, man, look here, look down here, exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand like that of age had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Through all the mysteries of wonderful creation, has monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children. But the words choked themselves rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. Spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are man's, said the spirit, looking down upon them, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware them both in all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out its hand toward the city. Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and bide the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time, with his own words. Are there no workhouses? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. Okay, that is the end of stave 3. But I think that it's worth talking a bit about these creepy children that the Ghost of Christmas Present confronts Scrooge with. So the most important thing to understand is that these are not actual children. These are allegories. So just like the Ghost of Christmas Past was memory itself, these children represent 2 different things. And it also tells us a lot about what Dickens thinks are terrible, I guess. So he says the boy is ignorance. So the boy represents ignorance itself, and the girl is want. Although the 19th century of the word want is not the same as we think of it. So we might think of it as like if you're wanting something, you're lacking in something, but we would more likely say need. Right? So it's as though she's poverty. So you've got ignorance and you've got poverty, and the ghost clearly tells him that even though these are both terrible things, and because they're allegories, like the way that we know they're terrible is that they're physically horrible to look at. They're twisted perversions of what children and youth should look like. So we know that poverty is terrible. We know that ignorance is terrible, but the ghost clearly tells us that the worst of the two is ignorance. And I think that's underscored in the whole text. And then, of course, he says his own words back to him, because Scrooge is not a deep thinker, and we rarely get the sense that whenever there's a metaphor or an allegory, or one of the ghosts is talking to him in this kind of like really elegant and elevated language, the Scrooge knows what they're talking about. He rarely does. He's a really, really literal-minded guy, so he probably doesn't get that these are allegorical figures. He thinks that they're actual children and they're poor, and so that's what his question is of like, have they refuge or resource? And golly, that's when the ghost says back to him, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And of course, like when he repeated the words back from Tiny Tim, his own words sound so much uglier when he's confronted with the reality of what they really mean. So that is the end of Stave 3. I hope that you get to go to many, many fun Christmas parties. I hope that, like Topper and the Plump Sister, you meet your true love and have a fun time at the parlor games. That's it.